Great. Thanks, Alex, and thank you all for joining today. Let me just get my screens set up correctly here. Sorry. Um, yeah, before we start, introduce myself, just want to recognize, I hope, and send good wishes to everyone. Obviously, we're discussing organizational health today and the importance of disturbance in natural ecosystems. Just want to recognize, obviously, everyone has health at the top of their mind currently with the coronavirus pandemic, officially a pandemic designated today by the WHO. So I just hope everyone is doing well. I hope all of you and your families and your communities, just sending you all best wishes. So a little bit about myself. I come to this work first and foremost as an ecologist. So I started my career studying natural systems, getting to be in them, getting to study them as an academic, and then later transitioned out of academia into running organizations of different kinds for the last 15 years. So deeply as an operator in running organizations, and I'm really honored to come to this partnership that is in rhythm of the four of us, really thinking about how to take our best understandings of how living systems and natural systems function and work, and how do we really apply them in a meaningful and operational way to all the organizations we are a part of. Our deep commitment for doing that is because we recognize that organizations, in the end, whether they be government or corporate or nonprofit, is the organizing body that is creating impact in this world. All of the complex challenges that we're facing, in the end, it is through organizations that we are facing them, creating solutions, trying to apply solutions. And so I know many of you on the call are sharing in that work with us. So thank you again for joining, and we'll jump right in. So just a little bit about expectations, or a little bit of a flow of what we'll discuss today. First, we're going to talk about the current challenge with organizations and understanding why are we looking to living systems design, which we'll discuss in some more detail. And then this webinar in particular will really focus on two important aspects of living systems. One is this idea of disturbance, or the importance of disturbance, or a disturbance regime. And very deeply connected to that is thinking about two different kinds of resilience. The word resilience is being used more and more, and we'll unpack that a little bit and talk about what we really mean by resilience from an ecological perspective. And throughout this, we want to introduce you to Rhythm's regenerative framework, which is our design process and our framework for how we think about creating, managing, and implementing regenerative practices in organizations. So I just want to start off with a question, and feel free to pop something in the chat here. If you had to choose a model, what is the most dominant model or metaphor for how we organize ourselves today, how we create our organizations? And feel free to unmute yourself or pop something in the chat.
We've got someone who says machines, Sita. Thank you, Sita. Chamath says machines externally designed.
Absolutely. Great. Good to see you, Sita. Thanks for joining us today. Good to see you, everyone. Absolutely. The machine has, just by almost default, is just how we think about our most of our organizations today. It's sort of the default model. These are just two images pulled sort of randomly from a Google search. One's showing a traditional consulting approach to a business, saying, think of your business as a machine, and each of the different points and departments of your business as different gears in a machine. Or thinking of the whole economic engine of Georgia as a machine of, again, this image of gears working together. And this model is so part of our thinking, so part of our subconscious. It's really built into our languages in ways that we're often not even aware of. How often have we said terms like this? Well, our team is working like a well-oiled machine. or referring to our own passions and time as saying, I don't have bandwidth for that, or saying we got to move the needle on this and we got to dial that in. And so language is an incredible sort of litmus or signal for how we think about the models or the underlying models of our thought processes and how we implement. And so clearly this machine language is deeply built into how all of us tend to talk about our work. And of course, if we thinking of businesses or organizations as machines, then of course we're thinking about people and machines as parts of a machine. And what do we do with parts of a machine? How do we treat parts of a machine, say in our used cars or in different appliances we have? And again, feel free to pop something in chat or unmute yourself. We're a fairly small group today.
Yeah, Chamath is replaceable. And earlier, Robert had said top-down centralized.
Yeah, so absolutely. So one of the assumptions of a machine is a very command and control, top-down hierarchical model. And absolutely, when a part breaks in a machine, in fact, we design machines to just force parts to run until they break and then we replace them. And so if we are treating ourselves and our employees and our members of our organizations as replaceable parts, that has significant consequences. And so what are the consequences of treating people like parts of a machine? We all know probably what it feels like individually, what the consequences are like, but we also can look at this at a collective level, and we recognize this is actually not really working in our organization. So this is results from an annual poll that Gallup puts out each year, measuring the self-identified level of engagement at work. And you can see pretty shockingly that only 13% identify themselves as engaged at work. 63%, as you can see from the graph, consider themselves sort of not engaged. They're checking their phone, they're listening to music, they're having a donut. And more amazingly, 24% identify as actively disengaged, which includes actively sabotaging the organization that they're working for. And so if this model of treating people like parts of a machine is clearly not working well for people, it's not really working well for productivity if that's our measure of success of an organization as well. In fact, Gallup, I didn't have it in the slide, Gallup estimates this is actually costing about $450 to $550 billion a year to the US economy, this level of disengagement. We of course know from an economic equality perspective, there's significant effects of this model and of this system, where we accept that there are individuals within our system that own organizations that have wealth that are now comparable or larger than entire countries. And wherever you stand on the political spectrum, this is clearly a sign that something has gone slightly awry, where this level of economic inequality is possible. And from an equity perspective, particularly in the US, I think this is true in most parts of the world, but particularly in the US, race is still the #1 predictor of how well you will do in each of these categories, from infant mortality to life expectancy to access to health, access to arts and culture, jobs, and education. And while this is daunting, the good news is that we see this at Rhythm as inherently a design issue, that we've chosen a mechanistic industrial model to design our organizations to, and we see lots of the intended and unintended consequences of that. And so if we design to a different model, we feel there's a lot of opportunities to change these patterns, to design our organizations in a different way. And part of the issue is that this industrial model, this mechanistic model, has worked well for certain types of industries, right? We've adopted it from the industrial sort of industrial revolution of productivity and creating things and making cars and making appliances. And so it's very good for certain types of problems, but not all types of problems. And as the world is becoming more complex and interconnected, we're moving more and more to different kinds of problems. So this is just one way of thinking about it. We can think of three types of problems, from a simple problem like baking a cake to a complicated problem like sending a rocket to the moon, or a complex problem like ending poverty. And actually the first two problems are very, very similar. One is just many simple problems put together. So if you take a simple problem like baking a cake, you have an ingredients list, you can follow a recipe, you can follow a series of known steps. There's some assumptions that you have to manage for, like high elevation baking. For anyone who's lived there, you have to adapt your processes, you have to adapt some of the recipes. And there's fairly repeatable results, right? You normally get a cake if you follow the recipes accordingly. And actually, in a very similar way, although much more complicated, there's many more steps, sending a rocket to the moon is very similar. There's a known series of inputs. You can follow a series of blueprints. You can follow a series of known steps. And the assumptions and effects of those assumptions are manageable, and you can have fairly repeated results. There's multiple countries sending rockets to the moon. Elon Musk is sending rockets to the moon. He blows one up every once in a while, but he's following a series of repeatable designs and repeatable steps. And very different to that then is this idea of a complex problem, such as ending poverty. There is no design blueprints for this. There's possibilities, there's suggestions, but part of the problem is we start from a place of already interdependent inputs. We don't know where we're starting. There's a whole bunch of connections and understandings and interrelationships that we don't know. And each situation is unique and different. Quickly, because of those interconnections, there's an unknown number of next steps. The assumptions we've made are also unknown. There's unintended consequences, and it quickly leads to unpredictable outcomes if we take a traditional mechanistic approach to solving those problems. And so the world is looking for, we think as well, and we know that we need a different kind of model to work with this kind of complexity and this type of complex problems that many of us are working with. And so there's lots of interest in looking to life as a different type of model. If we look around us, we look outside our window, we understand that living systems deal with complexity, manage complexity in ways that have been much more successful, or seemingly much more successful and resilient than our mechanistic approaches. But it's really important, if we're going to look to life as a model, that we look to the right model of life. Because again, life exists, living systems exist, and then humans have tried our best to understand them. And there's multiple competing models out there of how life works and what the living system is. So here's one. I love this movie. My wife is from South Africa. She loves this movie. But it's based on one particular idea of how life works, right? Which is this circle of life. And what are the assumptions of this circle of life? Despite the assumption of, singing warthogs and singing meerkats, what is this idea of a circle of life? What does this mean? What are our assumptions of how life works?
All animals are friends, no matter whether they're predator or prey.
Absolutely. And friends meaning what? That they, like, what's the extension of that?
Paula says everyone comes out happy in the end.
Right. Yes, absolutely. There's this idea that somehow it's in balance in a good sense. They understood that, but right, there's this assumption that somehow prey are just sort of naturally sacrificing themselves to predators for the good of this thing called life, right? So much so that they're willing to sing about it. They're willing to praise the birth of a new king, a new predator.
Yeah.
And so, yes. Sorry, go ahead.
A couple other thoughts. Chamath says not linear, and Robert says everything's useful and everything's used to serve everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. And so Compared to a mechanistic system, there is some idea of circles, is some idea of everything having a use. But really, if we're really looking at a model of life, this circle of life is really talking about or identifying cycles of life, right? This idea of predator and prey relationship is not that it is working in a perfect circle with each other, but it's based upon the recognition that when predator populations are high, then prey populations tend to decline. And when they decline too low, then the predator populations decline as well. We see this in bean weevils and predatory wasps, as well as moose and wolf populations. And to folks' points in the chat that you've pointed to already, we tend to forget that this circle of life or cycles of life are not necessarily maintained through deep friendship, but often involve a process like this, which is not particularly friendly to the moose or the wolf, or I'm sorry, the deer or the moose that was the victim of predation here. So I think humor is always an incredible sign or signal for society's changing understandings, and this is a incredible line of stuffy toys, blow-up toys, and art that you can buy called the Adorable Circle of Life, and each one of them is some predator munching on a prey animal and pointing to the sort of irony or missing piece of this model of life. So luckily for all of us, and we're really excited by this research, very recently a much more rich, much more deep view of life or model of life has emerged. And this came out of Chile, Santiago, by two amazing researchers, Humberto Maturana and Francisco Varela. And they were the first to really take a complete holistic or systems-based approach to actually understanding or asking this question: what makes a system living? What is a living system actually, and how does it function? And what they did was they took a relatively simple form of life, an E. coli bacteria, simple enough that they could examine and map every single chemical, material, and metabolic pathway for this bacteria. And they found some amazing things. They found that actually all the transitions and transactions and interconnections of each of those pathways led to this phenomenon that everything that was needed to maintain those pathways was actually generated by the cell itself within the cell wall, which the life also makes. And they recognize that this is actually a defining aspect of living systems that so far no mechanistic or human-made system has been able to recreate. And they coined this term autopoiesis, standing for self-poetry or self-making. And so this is actually the defining model of life, that life is in fact possible of regeneration. It's possible of self-maintenance. And so they define life as an organized system capable of maintaining itself within a boundary of its own making. And the rise of regenerative as a term, regenerative business, regenerative agriculture, is exciting, and we have a very specific definition to this, which we recognize that actually, based upon this work, only living systems are a model of regenerative systems. The living is synonymous with regenerative, and regenerative is synonymous with living. And so a lot of the work we're doing at Rhythm is then saying, what are the real system understandings, the system functions of living systems, and how can we apply those to our human organizations or human systems? And what's amazing about this work is they went on from this seminal discovery to ask some other questions that are really powerful for thinking about their application to living human systems or living social systems. The next question they asked was, where or is this, or how is this self-regenerative or autopoietic ability maintained? Is it located in any one place? They asked, where is this ability, where is life in the system? And they found that it's actually not based on any one place in the cell. It's not controlled by any one place, such as a brain or a nucleus or a central coordinating system. It's actually dependent on all the interconnected relationships of all the different parts of the cell. And so that living or life itself is in fact an emergent or holistic property. It's not located in any one place. In fact, it's stated in one of their papers that each part of life is not living per se, but life as a whole system is in fact living, which is a profound way to think about it. And so all of the relationships and all of the interconnected parts are needed for this whole to show the property of life. Interestingly, each part of complex systems, like or complex living organisms like humans or mammals, where we now find that each part is also a self-regenerating system or an autopoietic system. So we see this pattern of wholes within wholes. So we have another webinar where we go into some more detail about these fundamental discoveries of the Santiago School. But just to summarize, we're interested in living systems as a model for our businesses and our organizations because we recognize they manage complexity in a way in which abundance and resilience become recurring outcomes of the system. And we recognize that living systems are the only systems capable of self-regeneration, and that this ability to thrive, this ability to self-regenerate is dependent on all the interconnection parts of the system. Some other really amazing discoveries by the Santiago School was when you look at the relationship between life and the quote-unquote environment or whatever is outside of that organism, you find no separation. That life, in fact, consciously and willfully creates conditions necessary for life, and that we see nested systems or wholes within wholes.
Hey, Jeff, we've got a question from Robert that's
Sure.
really relevant for this slide. And he asks, he loves the ideas of connecting holism and emergence. Could you explain this a little more?
Yeah, I would say in many ways they're synonymous. So the idea of emergent property, well, both could be summed up with sort of the pithy statement that we're all used to, which is, the whole is more than the sum of its parts, right? So holism is that there are functions and there are patterns and processes that one can only understand by looking at the whole. And in this case, an emergent property is one of those patterns or one of those properties, so that life itself is this emergent property or a holistic property. You can really use them one and the same. So great question. So we want to present to you then how sort of our design process in rhythm, and then we're going to jump into this idea of disturbance more specifically. So what we recognize in rhythm is we know that if we start with the machine as the center of our design process, as our model, then we tend to engineer a set of best practices that we think we can apply in all situations. When we are the receiver of one of those best practices, I'm sure many of us have been running teams, running organizations, and we try to apply that, we tend to need to enforce those best practices into our unique situation, our unique organization, and they become very prescriptive structures where we try to enforce these structures. Ultimately, we see this as degenerating that original design, that original system. That system is constantly in a degenerative or degenerating state. In comparison, when we start with a living systems design, we use our best model of living systems, and this is why we're so excited by the Santiago School, to inform a set of design principles that we can design to depending on our specific condition or our specific unique context. And we use those principles to facilitate the creation of a flexible framework that we'll introduce, that we can, and if we use that framework, we can design, manage, and continue to monitor and foster the conditions for our organization such that we are actually regenerating both the organization as well as the system that we are a part of. Profoundly, when we design with the machine in mind, we tend to need more and more energy, more and more external inputs to put into that system. Agriculture is a great example. We know we can push a short-term yields with fertilizer and pesticides and external inputs, but we know we're degrading from the long-term health of that system. What's exciting for our organizations is to think about, when we design with living systems in mind, ultimately, if we are enhancing conditions for life, less external energy is needed because that system self-maintains. And our work at Rhythm then is to really recognize what are the shifts in perspectives and operations needed to move from this machine design approach to a living systems-based approach. And so our working definition of creating this kind of regenerative organization is that we recognize a regenerative organization as a living, evolving, and naturally functioning environment where abundance and resilience become recurring outcomes of really focusing on and creating potential for this underlying health, enhancing and maintaining underlying health. And this is where we really get to this idea. First, we summarize our work in this regenerative framework. And I won't go into too much detail for this, we'll come back to it. But we recognize that this is how we think about the main elements of a regenerative organization, and this is also a design process for how we think about designing regenerative organizations. When most of us think about organizations or designing organizations, we tend to jump to work first, right? We say, what are the products and services we want to create? What is our strategic plan? What's the technology and tools we need to do that? That's normally based upon some kind of mission or purpose, which we see as part of organizational context or why we're coming together as an organization. And what we don't tend to focus too much on, though, is really maintaining these four main elements of organizational health, that being thriving people, recognizing that people are the inherent energy flow of an organization, and empowering and resourcing those people to be intelligent decision makers through the information cycle, which we'll talk about a lot more in a minute. And recognizing we need interconnected, relevant communication for that system to thrive, and that we recognize an inherent connection between the diversity of our organizations, the diversity of our connections to the resilience and thriving of that system. Where we spend a lot of time with organizations supporting them then is thinking about structures such as governance, roles and responsibilities, how we meet, how we make decisions, and we look at designing those in a way that inherently enable health or create conditions for health, as well as are the platform for the work we're trying to achieve together. Ultimately, the last column in this graph is what we're after. We're after, value and wealth creation that is part of recurring outcomes of health, that ultimately the organization is resilient to the ever-changing conditions, and that we're really tapping into or releasing unlimited potential, again, that we're finding those holistic or emergent properties of our organizations. What is more than the sum of its parts? What is more than the sum of each individual element or person in our organization? What does that unlimited potential look like? This is just another way to understand the four key elements of organizational health. Just to reiterate, we see these as four intersecting processes, being energy flow, information cycle, communication cycle, and network connections. And so looking at disturbance specifically, it's particularly interesting that this regenerative ability of natural systems is really dependent upon disturbance. If we look at almost all natural systems, the ability to regenerate is deeply connected with the process of death and decay, and the reorganization of those materials and nutrients in a way that reuses them, creates new possibilities. And we see this in almost all natural systems. And this process, or this disturbance cycle, or this disturbance regime is a term that's also used, is really vital for maintaining the health of this system. Just a few examples then from natural systems. One of the most studied and well-known ones is this idea of fire-adapted forests, right? this is a lodgepole pine forest, that we often see the coverage or news media on forest fires as a devastating event, which it is when we're looking at the destruction of families and property. But from a purely perspective of the forest itself, it's actually designed into the system. It's part of the regenerative ability of the system. The seeds or the cones of lodgepole pines are said to be serotinous cones, is a term, which means they actually need fire to release and germinate. They will sit dormant in that soil for generations and generations until there's a fire. They actually need the heat to be released. And once they are, within a year, all of those seeds are released and saplings start emerging. And this process of ongoing fire, ongoing regeneration, periodic fire coming through, leads to significant diversity of these systems, particularly in the understory or the understory of this forest, undergrowth of this forest. Now, managing forests, or forest managers have recognized this importance, and so this management system of controlled burns has been put in place. And this, at the most simplistic view, we might have heard of this as necessary to make sure there's not too much fuel in the fire, right? There's not too much downed wood and burnable materials on the forest floor so that a fire becomes out of control. We need to be able to maintain fires. We need to maintain the resilience of that system, or maintain the impact on our neighboring human communities by making sure we keep the amount of fuel down. But actually, the process of management, or the tool of management of a controlled burn, is actually a lot more sophisticated. It's recognizing that each different types of forests actually have different types of fires. Some forests are adapted to very frequent but low intensity and small in size, there's geographic scale, small fires, which is shown here as low and mixed. While at the other end of the spectrum, other forests have adapted to very infrequent fires, 200 plus years, where actually the entire stand, both overstory and understory, is replaced. And if we're really to use controlled burns as a way to manage this disturbance, we actually have to understand that disturbance is something much richer than just amount of fuel in the forest floor, but it actually involves a whole regime. It involves timing, it involves scale, it involves type, it involves severity. And so it's a much richer understanding of what we mean by disturbance. Another example that a lot of our work has actually grown out of is the importance of regeneration in grasslands. So grasslands similarly have evolved over time to be grazed upon by extremely large and dense herds of herbivores. Large herbivores, in this case wildebeest, come through the grasslands. They're compressed together because of natural predators, and they trample and defecate and create a lot of short-term immediate disturbance in one area. But then they move on, and those grasslands have adapted to be able to regrow, to regenerate, to use the fertilizer of the manure of those herds of wildebeest as nutrients to regenerate. And this process of mimicking the natural disturbance regime, which is the technical way of saying let's actually look to what nature does and try to mimic it, is executed brilliantly in the process of holistic management that's been developed by Alan Savory and the Savory Institute, which we have some deep connections with. And they recognize that we can use fences as a replacement for predators. We can manage the different parts of our land in different ways and mimic how these natural herds of herbivores move through the landscape using livestock as a way to regenerate those grasslands. And this has shown incredible results. This is the pre-existing state of a piece of land in Mexico that was managed in this way. And the next slide that you'll see is the same piece of land without any external inputs added to this. There's no seed, no fertilizer, no water. It was simply mimicking these natural disturbance regimes in a way that just released the potential, released the seed bank that was already there. And in a short period of under 5 years, that land was transformed back to this state through this process of mimicking natural disturbance. And the important part of these natural systems is understanding there's a very big difference between how we use this word resilience. And the work of C.S. Halling, actually even 20 years ago, now recognized that engineers and ecologists use the word resilience in very different ways. And so he coined the term engineering resilience, and you can see by this figure that this is the idea that a system is resilient if it can return back to its original state. And so if you imagine this to be a marble and a cup and disturbance to be shaking the cup, then resilience is having the sides of that cup or that bowl higher and higher, so that the larger the disturbance, the more chance that the marble will fall back to the stable state of the center of the cup, versus fly out the top of this, which would be a collapse of the system in this graph. Natural systems show a very different kind of resilience, which is summarized by this graph here, which is that Halling recognized that in natural systems like that cycle through different states, like the forest, like the grasslands, there's actually multiple stable states. There's multiple places of resilience. So here there's a disturbance like a fire or a herd of buffalo coming through, where the marble is pushed out of one state, but it lands quickly into a separate stable state or a multiple stable state. And that what makes ecological systems or natural systems resilient is that they have these multiple stable states. The marble never flies out of the graphic completely. Actually, if we look at our own bodies, our own bodies are regulated in a very similar way. Our body temperature, right, we have a standard body temperature that we consider to be healthy of 98.6 in Fahrenheit, and I can't remember what the Celsius is, but that is one stable state. And then when we are sick, when we are invaded, we actually get a fever. And this, we normally think of a fever as just a sign of sickness, but this is actually a new stable state that the body is using to fight off infection. A high body temperature is actually beneficial in fighting off a virus, fighting off a bacteria. And that is another stable state that the body maintains, and then it returns back to a different stable state of our standard 98.6 temperature when that virus or bacteria or infection is cured. And so how do we apply this to human organizations then? And what's important to remember is all the examples we look to, or all our understanding of natural systems, we're talking about cycles and processes involving chemicals and the physical properties of things, nutrients, molecules, energy, carbons, nitrogen. And so the element of regeneration is biophysical in a natural system. A major translation to a social system then, like a human organization, is actually understanding that the element of regeneration in this case is actually information. Information is the equivalent of nutrients for an organization. And there's actually some pretty interesting sociological research that supports this idea that we can go into another time. So what we see as particularly important in creating regenerative organizations then is thinking about information as the information life cycle, allowing information to go through similar states of birth and death, disturbance and decay, being reorganized into new forms of information, and being able to be applied in new ways. And of course, information is a somewhat abstract sense, but information can be manifest as ultimately manifest as decisions in organizations, right? Information is our processes, it's our decisions, it's our behaviors we make with each other. It's also our products and services. And so we see this process of decision-making and information lifecycle as deeply important in thinking about how we manage and create and think about our organizations as living systems. Following that logic then is we ask a lot and we work with organizations to say, well, we recognize that information needs to cycle, information needs to go through this life cycle, then how do we intentionally create planned disturbance, create intentional disturbance into this life cycle to create health? So what is the equivalent of a controlled burn for our organizations? What's the equivalent of holistic management in grasslands for our organizations? And so this idea of planned disturbance, and again, it's important to always include the word planned. So, we're not saying disturbance in and of itself is a good thing. So, we're not saying run into your local office mates and just disturb them in any way, and somehow that's a good thing. We're saying that this type of planned disturbance of the system, recognizing we need to refresh and renew and reorganize, is what is healthy and regenerative. So we think of it as planned disturbance as some type of intentional design or management process with the intention of enabling healthy conditions to be created in the living environment of our organization. And so I'll pause there for some questions and also a little bit of a reflection from you all. Ask you to, well, first I'll take a few questions, but then I ask each of you just to take 1 or 2 minutes and just think about what is one practice or idea that actually needs to die in your organization, that needs to go through a decay process to be reorganized, to regenerate and give birth to something new. So take a few minutes, think about that. When you have some ideas, again, put them in the chat so we can all see them. And then if you are inspired, also, please feel free to unmute yourself and share your ideas with the rest of the group.
Hey Jeff, this is Kristen. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, hey Kristen.
I think for us, especially with my working group, meetings to prepare for meetings are fine, but meetings for the sake of meetings, if we can get that down to a 15-minute communication cycle and then everyone can go on about their day, that would be a wonderful thing that could die for us.
Yeah, that's a great example. Many of us inherit and continue meeting structures just because they're there, right? Weekly team meetings, stand-up meetings. We often join an organization, and most often I've definitely been part of teams where if someone were to ask when this started, probably no one would know because it's just cycled through and it just remains. So yeah, great example, Kristen. Meetings is a great area that can really use a lot of design and thinking along these lines.
It's funny, things like meetings tend to become so sacred. It's like, well, we've always been doing it this way. And this really helps you think about, how can we can shift that. Just because we've always done it this way, we don't need to.
That's great. maybe one more. Anyone else want to share either in the chat or unmute yourself?
Hi, this is Sita here. I'm driving, so I'm taking you all with me to pick my kids up.
Thanks for joining, Sita.
Yeah, I just recently read Rob Hopkins' book that came out last fall it's called From What Is to What If? And it has me thinking about some of these more like really extending into a more and more radical space when I think about what needs to die. And so have been playing around, especially lately, with this coronavirus, which is impacting me quite directly financially, and wondering what would it look like if we just let die the idea that we have to sell our services for money, and what is the entire reorganization of work that would arise from that kind of a question. So that's one thing I'm thinking about immediately, and it's having some implications for some experimentation locally around creating a time bank and things like that. So that's what it sparked for me.
Thank you. That's fascinating. Thank you for bringing up, the highest level, of course, of, disturbance and thinking about disturbing systems is obviously if we are looking at redesigning and remanaging our institutions in a different way. At some point in this process, we're going to need to deeply examine and disturb some of the really large institutional forms of oppression, inequity that have gotten us to this place, that have been designed and gotten us to this place that we mentioned probably too briefly in the start of this very short webinar. So thanks for bringing that awareness, Sita. So I'll move on and ask you to continue to think about these reflections. Hopefully they're useful for you. And so just a little bit, some more examples of how we work with organizations in this way. So one way was, again, if we think about planned disturbance, is we've actually worked with organizations to create a disturbance calendar. To really, again, and it's important to ensure that disturbance is not just making everything shut down or really upsetting someone's day or process. But by creating a calendar, this allows us to really, as an entire organization, think about how do we really want to periodically bring in new thinking, ask our questions, what needs to be recycled, what needs to die, what needs to change, how do we reorganize, and more importantly, that we've planned in and have an implementation plan for what to do with that disturbance, right? So it's one thing to have an event to create new thinking, but do we have a plan in place to really reorganize and really replan with those new insights in mind? Just another couple examples of questions you can ask yourself, and we'll share these slides. So just we'll ask you to, or allow you to reflect on these. Some questions we ask ourselves: disturbance events, disturbance exercises. What are we putting energy into currently that's not producing the results that we wish to see? And that's a great first question to say: is it time to let them go? Or similarly, what have we chosen to not invest in for the last 6 months? What do we continue to, for some reason, say no to? And maybe it's time to take a look at the assumptions of that and say, why are we continuing to say no to something? And maybe the reason we're saying no should die and be re-examined. Or Sita, I love your thought process. There is an external change, an external pressure that is creating, has a business expense or has impact on us. What do we examine there, and what needs to change? The last one I borrowed from is more sort of the intention of this. One of my favorite music producers is Brian Eno, and he's famous for producing the album of different types of bands that's always the weirdest and most experimental and most strange, like Talking Heads and U2 and others. And he has this incredible set of processes that he uses to really disturb and make people think about things in a different way. And one that I saw in a documentary was after the band finished playing the song, he said, okay, now pass your instrument to the person on your right and replay it. And what did you notice? And so let's play around with that. What would that look like in an organization? What if we were to change roles and responsibilities to the person sitting to our left each day and ask them specifically to say, what do you notice about this? What's different? What could be changed? Or what's working or what's not working? So I'll skip through these. Another reflection I'll ask you can do on your own time after the webinar is really playing with this idea of resilience. You know, ultimately what we are trying to create is resilient organizations. What are the real implications? Have we really been thinking about it as this sort of single stable state engineering resilience, or are we designing for really multiple stable states? And so what area of your organization do you feel like you're trying to control in an engineering resilience mindset? Because really that is about control. It's about making those walls of that cup higher and higher versus how could we manage that situation in a way that it allows for different states to exist. You know, I think a lot about the stock market, right? It's only designed for one state. It's designed just to grow. And somehow every time, even though it goes in a cycle, it jumps to a different state, it's a disaster, or it's a sign of impending disaster for our economies. What would it look like to actually design an economy that recognizes different stable states, recognizes times of surplus, times of decline, times of storage? What would that look like? And so we ask ourselves this question for organizations as well. And I'll end just by recognizing that this process that we're all part of, and Rhythm is trying to support, of moving from a machine-based organization to a living-based organization, we recognize comes with significant changes in perspectives and operations. And this view of disturbance, hopefully, is one way of changing a perspective or set of operations. And so we recognize some really important shifts that we see across the whole organization. We recognize that managing with a living systems in mind means moving from managing the parts of the system to really managing the whole, which asks us to move from this top-down dominance type of management to really recognizing interdependence, both within and between organizations. We shift our management from trying to find recipes to trying to create responses, trying to understand how do we create the best possible conditions to respond to changes we know inevitably are coming. Related to that then is how do we move from managing with this idea of prediction in mind, being able to predict the future, to recognizing that if we understand the patterns, we have a better chance of creating conditions for health and emergence. When we look at some of the most deeply entrenched aspects of our organizations that lead to institutional racism and oppression, then we recognize we're moving from an extractive model of seeing people as simply parts, expendable parts of machine, to really a true commitment to equity. And deeply, of course, connected to that is we move away from centralized power to decentralized empowerments for all stakeholders in all parts of the system. So I want to end with some inspirational quotes. And here is a quote, and I want to play a little game because I find this really inspiring, actually, who said this. So the quote itself is very aligned and really inspiring. It says that the temptation to lead as a chess master, controlling each move of the organization, must give way to approach as a gardener, enabling rather than directing. A gardening approach to leadership is anything but passive. The leader acts as an eyes-on, hands-off enabler who creates and maintains an ecosystem in which the organization operates. And just given our short time, I'll tell you that comes from, I was super surprised when I learned where this quote came from. This actually comes from General Stanley McChrystal, who was the head of the war efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan, who recognized that war and the nature of war, the problem of war, is changing dramatically, and the counterterrorism efforts could not be dependent upon this hierarchical command and control system that we've all inherited. I find this incredibly inspiring that in some ways we've inherited this model of organization from a military model, and the military itself needs to be looking at managing in a new way. And obviously, one criticism we often hear, or one hesitation we hear to our work is, oh, well, that works great for, nice groups of people who all like each other, but it won't work for, really situations in which there's high risk and lots of consequences. And so recognizing that obviously the high risk, high consequence environment of a war situation is also recognizing that leadership and management needs to change and move to a new way.